Hi, and welcome to my channel. My name is Camille, and this space has been specially curated to help you dig deeper into the Word of God. And I'm not talking about a fluffy, surface level study. No, I'm talking about deep, soul stirring Bible study. Okay? So if that sounds like something you might be interested in or something you can benefit from, then stick around and maybe consider subscribing. So today we're going to be diving into the book of Esther. If you have been following me on TikTok, you know I like to do the bite size studies. And the reason I'm bringing it to YouTube now is because a lot of you have requested a slowed down, much more in detail um, breakdown of our Bible studies. And so we're going to start that over here and we're going to kick everything off with the book of Esther. Now, every single time I come to a new book of the Bible, the first thing that I do is I read it. I read it all the way through. And as I'm getting ready to study, I will read it without taking notes. And then I'll read it and I'll just start to take notes on things I'm observing, any themes I'm noticing come up, any questions I might have, anything I might have find interesting or want to do research on. I'll take those notes. Okay. And then I sit down and I go over the background information. And this is where we are today. Okay. So these are the general categories that I like to review. It varies from book to book. Like theology isn't always a category I look for, but it's very, very prevalent for this book of Esther. So that's why it's there. And I just go through and I do research on what it is I'm about to get into. Because I wasn't born during this time, this is an ancient text. And so the culture was different. What was expected was different. All of that is stuff that we have no idea about living in the world that we live in today. So it's important for us to go back, figure out what was going on so we can have the right frame of reference as we go forward and study it. Okay. So obviously, we're in the book of Esther. Esther is in the Old Testament, and it is considered one of the historical books. Now, there is a wide debate on whether or not this is actually a historical account. I'm not going to get into that for the sake and purpose of this study. This is a historical book, okay? We don't know exactly who the author was. Um, it's likely someone who was an eyewitness to what was going on or someone who knew the Persian culture well, but we don't specifically know the exact person. And we also don't know who it was written to. There is no written evidence of the original audience or the original readers, so we just don't know. Now, the setting, this is where we get our bread and butter, okay? This is going to ground us. Um, with what we need to know as far as studying the text goes. Okay. So where are we? We are in Susa. Susa is the capital city of Persia, and it's a royal city. And during this time, the Jews are under Persian rule, and Persian rule started in 539 BC and ended 331 BC. Okay. The events in this book specifically likely occur between 483 to 473 BC, so roughly a 10-year time span. And during this time, the Jews were under captivity. They were in captivity under the Persian rule. Okay. This is post Babylonian exile, about 100 years afterward. And then some of the Jews did end up going back to their homeland while there were others who remained. Now, let's pause here because I did do some extra research on this and I want to take you guys into this because as I'm learning this, I'm just like Babylonian exile, Persian rule, like what specifically happened? What do I need to know? And some of you might not know, so I'm going to share what I found, what I researched and studied on this. Okay, so big ideas to know. There were 5 different eras of rule of the political history in Jewish history. Okay, so you have first the Babylonians, Babylonian rule, Persian rule, Hellenistic, the Hasmonean, and then the Romans. Okay, we're only going to talk about Babylonian and Persian today. That's all we need to know for this. Babylonian rule was from 605 to 539 BC, so before our time period dealing with Esther. But why we need to know this is because when the Babylonians took over, this was important because they tried to basically assimilate the Jews into their culture. Okay, follow me. They took them out of their homeland And they did things like try to change their names, get them accustomed to their ways of life. And it was all done in order to undermine national solidarity and racial identity. However, the Jews were able to preserve their identity and their unity in Babylon. Okay, so we know that the Babylonians took the Jews out of their homeland. Why that's important is because when we get to the Persian rule, which was from 539 to 331 BC, we see that now they're allowing the captives to return back to their homeland. So we have three separate returns to Jerusalem. The first was in 537 BC, the second was in 457 BC, and then we had a third in 444 BC. So the Persian foreign policy, yes, they allowed them to go back home, but they established provinces with governors that allowed religious freedom and allowed the Jews to return home. That's the main thing that we need to know as far as it relates to the book of Esther. But again, I go back to say that the Jews were in captivity under Persian rule. Okay, this was a time of extreme oppression for them. So just make a note of that. Now, why was this book written? Well, the book of Esther asks us to trust in God's providence. It's an invitation to look for God's hand, basically, how he works everything out. It shows God's unfailing preservation of his people, and the author also describes how the Feast of Purim began. And this is a feast that's still widely celebrated by Jews today. So we get to see that establishment and why that's important to the Jewish culture. Theology, like I said, I don't always uh, look into this category, but it's so prevalent here in the book of Esther, I can't ignore it. So, in the book of Esther, we are really introduced to this idea of providential intervention or the doctrine of divine providence. Now, I did do some in detail studying on that as well because I was curious about it. And I'm one of those people, I have to chase the rabbit trail. When my mind is set on something, it's like I have to know all of the details. So I'll tell you a little bit about it, okay? So this is the book that I used to get this information. This is actually one of my textbooks that I had in seminary. Great resource. Okay, this has so many answers to our Christian faith. So many concepts are discussed in this book, and so I do recommend this if you want to look into it. Okay. Doctrine of divine providence is broken down in this text. And what we learn is that providence has three separate components. So, providence is the continuing work of God to sustain in existence the created universe and all that it contains, directing it toward its divinely designed end. It's God's ongoing activity to care for or provide for what He has created. That's what providence is. It's God doing and everything that he's supposed to do and taking care of us and how things are working out and all of those things. Okay. The first tier or component is preservation. And this is talking about God's work to maintain the creation in existence and functioning as he designed it. Okay. So things going in the way that God intended. Concurrence is the next one. And this is God's work of collaborating with all created realities as they act and occur. And then the third is government. And this is God's work of directing the creation towards its divinely purposed end. Okay. Now there's meticulous providence, which asserts that God ordains and controls everything that happens. And then there is general providence. And this is basically a view that God attends broadly, but not exhaustively to what occurs. Now, in this book, the author really does his best to show sort of some of the errors that come into play as he's talking about the different topics. So that's what this is. I will point out two that I think should be mentioned. The first one being this overemphasizing of divine providence and minimizing human responsibility, right? So that's sometimes an error that can come up. And then this one down here is the reverse, where it states that you overemphasize human responsibility and minimize divine providence without really acknowledging the balance that occurs. And then the book is great at teaching, how you can sort of live out and practice some of the things that it teaches in a section that he has called Enacting the Doctrine. And this basically says that number one, we should find comfort and assurance in divine providence. And number two, while we avoid both extremes of irresponsibility and hyper responsibility, by trusting in divine providence along with making decisions and acting in line with God's purpose. Okay, so that's just a little bit of extra information. You by no means need to know all of that stuff. If you don't want to, I did just sum up divine providence here to mean essentially it's a belief in God's sovereign guidance, care, and governance of the universe. Okay? It's God working everything out for his purpose, his plan, in the way that he says that it should go. And then of note, I just wrote down here that God is not mentioned by name, not once in the entire book of Esther. And I think this is important to notice because we have this divine providence occurring, but we don't actually hear God being mentioned. And I think this book calls us to sort of sit down and reflect on how God might be working in our lives and we don't even realize it. You know what I mean? And we'll definitely talk more about that as we go through the book of Esther. And then another thing to note is that prayer is never mentioned, but fasting is. And during this time and in this cultural dynamic, if you fasted, you prayed, those two things sort of went hand in hand. So we can assume that fasting is, or that prayer is occurring just by the mention of fasting, but it doesn't outright say prayer either. So that's our book of Esther in a nutshell as far as the historical background and context is concerned. I really did want to give you guys a slowed down version of what you're seeing on TikTok. TikTok is sped up and it's unrealistic in the sense of how long it takes me to compile information and to go over information. And I know a lot of you have requested these slower, more thought out videos. So here you go. And if you are not already following me on TikTok for those bite-sized videos, please go check me out over there. And I'm also using Substack, and I'll leave all of this stuff linked below, but I'm also using Substack to have sort of a written version of what we're discussing from video to video. It'll be sort of like a Bible study catalog, especially as we grow and develop in the studies that we're doing. So I hope this was helpful to you guys. Next week, we are going to be diving into Esther chapter 1. I'm thinking about giving you guys a midweek video that just breaks down sort of the process of Bible study for me, because certainly you can watch me do these Bible studies, but I think it's also helpful to see what my actual process is. And I mean from start to finish. Okay. So if you think that would be interesting, just leave me a quick comment. But that's all I've got for you guys today. And I'm so happy that you all were able to join me. And I will see you all in Esther chapter 1. Bye, y'all.